Hello, fourth year students. Today our lecture in literary criticism is about Matthew Arnold, and you are already familiar with this name, Matthew Arnold, because you studied a poem by him, if you remember, in poetry, in the first course, Dover Beach. So you already know that Matthew Arnold belongs to the Victorian Age. And you are going to see how he represents this time period, the Victorian Age and literary criticism. What happened, or what are the new things which occur in terms of, let's say, theories, ways of literary criticism through what Matthew Arnold has produced. So, since we studied Victorian Age in poetry, you should be now familiar with what happened, historically speaking, with what happened in the Victorian Age. What are the, let's say, the changes that happened in that period? Why is it important now to remember these things? Because we are going to see that the same changes which affected literature also affected literary criticism, or let's say the way that literary criticism is dealing with literature now. So before we start knowing in details what are the basic, let's say, theories or views of literary criticism for Matthew Arnold, let's take a look at the Victorian Age itself. What happened in this age? Let's remind ourselves. Writers, philosophers, and scientists began to give more credence to empirical and rationalistic methods for discovering nature and truth. You remember from our lectures in poetry, we said that in the Victorian Age, science has a new, let's say, a new value in society now. People started to believe in science. People started to see that when it comes to science, science gives more basic facts, more reliable facts, more than, let's say, religion. So science now has, let's say, excelled upon religion and upon any other fields. So why is it important? We know in science we have something which is called scientific method. Scientific method, sometimes it is called empirical. طبعا empirical تعني تجريبي. What is it? Or let's say, what is the scientific method? Or what do we mean by this term? This term means that, for example, as a scientist, I'm going to observe something. First of all, there is observation. I'm going to observe a phenomenon, يعني ظاهرة, something which would attract my attention, which happens in nature, for example. Based on what I observed, I'm going to form a hypothesis, which is what we call in Arabic فرضية. So I'm going to suppose that what I saw, either it is, let's say, true or false. How I'm going to make sure of this? Through experiment. Let's say scientists would conduct a certain experiment. This experiment is something like a test for the validity of the hypothesis. So I made a hypothesis, I want to experiment, to make a test, so that to make sure whether my hypothesis is true or false. And then based on the results of my testing, of my experiment, I'm going to come up with what? A theory, or sometimes it is a law. يعني يا أما قانون أو نظرية. Okay, so this is the scientific method which was followed mostly, let's say, by scholars, by scientists, when they were trying to improve, or let's say develop, the scientific fields. So this method was against the romantic concepts of emotion, individualism, and intuition. You remember also the romantic philosophy, the Romantic period. The period which comes before the Victorian Age is called the Romantic period. You are also familiar with this period. What do we have in this Romantic period? What are, let's say, the principles? If you remember what we discussed last year when we were talking about the Romantic age, this age stressed or emphasized what? Emotion, individual experiences, experiences which are based on what? On intuition, which is something totally, let's say, contrastive or against what? Against this scientific method. يعني شلون مثل نقول شخص يعتمد على التجارب العلمية الموثقة وأكو شخص يعتمد على الحدث الشعور. This is the, let's say, the contrast between these two ages. So people in the Victorian age, especially after the development in science, they started to leave these concepts. They see that these concepts, they can't make you reach to a certain truth, or for example reach to facts. They are not reliable. You cannot rely, for example, on emotions or on let's say intuition in order to reach to truth. So people in that time, let's say writers, philosophers, scientists, they started to leave the Romantic concepts and principles, and they want something more scientific. Okay, so science took the place of religion and philosophy as more what? Relevant vehicle for understanding reality. It is more, let's say, relevant, it is practical, it is empirical, it is based on facts, experiments, observations. So this is the new mentality. يعني ها صارت هي العقلية الجديدة في العصر الفيكتوري. So what is the effect of that on our critic Matthew Arnold? When we come to Matthew Arnold, let's see what are the special features of his criticism. First of all, he quotes and borrows from the classical literature. You see, this is something we saw even the other critics do as well. For example, like John Dryden, like Sir Philip Sidney, they used to take and borrow from the classical literature, and we see that Arnold also does the same. So what did he take from the classical literature? From Aristotle. You remember Aristotle? He took the idea that poetry is higher than history or any other activity. So he started to, let's say, mix between these different views and ideas. From Aristotle, he took this idea that poetry is higher than history, and if you go back to our lectures on Aristotle, you will see that this is one of his main ideas when he compared between poetry and history. From Plato, also we know Plato, he took the idea that literature reflects society and should present its values and concerns. You remember Plato? What was Plato's attitude from literature and from poetry and literature in general? He believed that poetry and literature should be related to society because they reflect the values of society, the social values of society. So according to Arnold, he saw that Plato was actually right about this idea, and he took from him this idea of the, let's say, the effect of literature on what? On society as a whole. From Longinus, he took the definition of a literary classic. You remember Longinus? Also, one of the main things we studied about Longinus is that he presented definition of literary classic. يعني الأعمال الكلاسيكية. شنو اللي يخلينا نعرف مثلا هذا العمل يعتبر أو يصنف من الكلاسيكيات، يعني الأعمال الخالدة. Okay, so you see, from each one of them he took something. Okay, so let's see what is the new thing which Arnold came with. It is actually something which is called the social criticism. Social criticism. This is an interesting title. So this is a new kind of criticism, which is what? Social. What do we mean by social? So it is related to society, of course. What is the title of his book? The Study of Poetry. So pay attention here. In his study, The Study of Poetry, Arnold asserts the social role of criticism. So what is the new thing about Arnold? Is that he tries to show what? That criticism actually has a social role. It does something on the level of society. How can this be achieved? The critic should avoid politics or any other activity that would lead to bias. شو تقصد bias? Bias means الانحياز, تحيز. And you know, when we speak about politics, for example, if a critic is criticizing a work based on politics, for example, سياسة يعني, this is going to make him biased to a certain party, for example. يعني ممكن يتحيز إلى جهة معينة خصوصا من يتكلم بالسياسة. So for Arnold, a critic should avoid politics. Before Arnold, a literary critic cared only for the beauties and defects of works of art. But Arnold, the critic, chose to be the educator and guardian of public opinion and propagator of the best ideas. What does this mean? So before Arnold, if you remember, for example, that those we studied, whether we are talking about Sir Philip Sidney, whether you are talking about Plato, Dante, most of the time, if you notice, they were more concerned with what? Beauties and defects of work of art. For example, I'm going to have this poem or a novel, and I will try to see what are the good points, let's say the negative points, the positive things about maybe the structure, the form, the ideas, the themes, the characters, and the critic is going to give an account for what he sees is good or bad about this work of literature. For Arnold, this is not only this is not the only thing that the critic should be focused on. He has also to what? To make sure that he is going to what? To see whether this work educates people or not. Sometimes there are some works of literature or art, they just give, let's say, kind of amusement, entertainment to the readers or audience. But for Arnold, this is not enough. A work of literature should educate people, and it should what? It should guard, let's say, the values of society. It should add something to the values and principles of society. Okay? So the critic, when he comes to criticize a work, he should make sure that this work has some kind of social role. For example, I'm going to read a certain poem. I am a critic. I'm going to read a certain poem, and as I am going through it, I should make sure that the poet is not talking, for example, about politics. He's not talking about some, let's say, controversial things like religion, like sexual things. I should make sure that he is keeping in mind the, let's say, the social values of the society, what is appropriate for society, for readers. Okay, so this is the social role according to Arnold. Another thing which is also related to Arnold is what we call the objective method. And by the way, this is related to our introduction in the beginning of the Victorian Age. How may the best poetry be achieved or discovered? Okay, so now I am a critic. and I want to follow the method of Arnold in criticism. How should I do that? What is the method? What is the method according to Arnold? This is what he calls the objective criteria, which is actually taken, or let's say derived, from the scientific method. يعني هو نقدر نقول كان متأثر هاي الأجواء العلمية, because most let's say philosophers and writers were following scientific objective methods, so he also tried to take this objective, let's say, or scientific method and apply it on literary criticism. So how can this be done? The critic's task is to have in mind lines and expressions of the great poets and to apply them as standards upon which he judges other poetry. So the critic, let's say he observes a certain poem and he wants to judge this poem. What does he do? Basically, he should have memorized, or he should know other lines of poetry for great poets. Like, for example, let's say Shakespeare. For example, he knows certain lines of poems by Shakespeare, and when he's going to judge the new poem, he's going to compare between this new poem and Shakespeare's poem, so that he knows whether it is whether the poem, let's say, comparing it with Shakespeare, is it good or bad? Does it apply, or let's say, can it reach to this level of good poetry, just like Shakespeare's poetry? Okay, he achieves that through comparing the newly written lines to the classical great poems. Not only Shakespeare, of course, we have many examples, like John Milton, like Homer, if we are talking about the classical Greek poetry. Based on that, he would decide whether the poem is good or bad. Okay, so just like when in scientific methods we have some facts or standards based on which we come up with theories, based on which we let's say measure or compare the phenomena that we observe, Arnold is trying to do the same in literature. We see a new poem and then we try to compare it to the great established poems. What's the problem with this new method? In practice, what does this mean in practice? يعني هنقول إذا جينا نريد نطبق هاي النظرية أو هاي المethod, what happens? Such objective method fails. See, it fails. Why? It introduces subjective approach instead. طبعا تعرفون أنتو subjective يعكس objective. So why does it fail? The reason is, as it is stated here, whose judgment shall we follow? So okay, we want to apply this method. For example, as a critic, I don't think that Shakespeare is one of the greatest poets, but maybe someone else would think that he's great. So based on what I decide, for example, that this poet is great, and I'm going to judge the poets based on his poetry. See, this is a problem. Who decides which poet's lines should be the standard for comparing? Because يعني هاي خلينا نقول مسائل الشعر، أي شاعر هو الأفضل، أي قصيدة هي الأحسن، خلينا نقول أي مقتطفات من قصيدة هي تعتبر الأفضل. This is something related to taste, literary taste. Maybe you think some lines are beautiful, other would think no, they are not. So this is something subjective, you see. That's why this method fails. This is something subjective. It is based on your own taste, your own preference. This is not objectivity. Okay? Need the critic to rank all past poets to decide who's great and who's not? Who decides Shakespeare is great, for example, but Marlowe is not? Who gives this decision? You see, and which society's moral values are to be considered the standard? Since our poet believes in social criticism, for example, if you are living in the English society, you have certain moral values, but what if you go to another society, like the French, for example? Maybe they have different moral values. They are not all the same. So the critic in this case becomes an authority on values, culture, and taste instead of interpreting a literary work. So this leads to what? Instead of being a critic who judges a literary work based on artistic standards and values, he becomes someone who is as if he's responsible for values and culture, or to decide what people should like and what they shouldn't like. This is not the, let's say, this is not the role of the critic. That's why Arnold theory's, let's say, method fails here. Okay, so this was all about Matthew Arnold. Thank you very much for listening.